Hey guys, my name is Leona O'Callaghan and I'm the founder of the Haven Hub. Um, so you're on a list at the moment where you're going to get QPR training. This is part of that training, but please know that unless you have actually completed the interactive part of the training, then you can't be certified. So while everything you learn here on the video, I ask you to really try and give this your attention. At the same time, this video isn't sufficient to actually qualify you in QPR. You need to actually be part of the interactive discussions and the interactive part of asking the question and the role plays. However, this is where some of the information and where everything will kind of tie in nicely together when you do the part two. Part two is, as I say, as a group, it's interactive. It'll have two facilitators usually, and you get to role play and you get to actually ask the question. You get to go through the process of QPR. Whereas this is kind of giving you the background. It's giving you the knowledge that you'll need, and it'll all make so much more sense once you've watched this video, and once you've actually seen why maybe that you take the different measures that you take. So during your QPR, you will be asked questions. You will be asked to kind of give opinions on different parts of this video. So please do watch it. Please do watch it at a time when you can give it your full attention. It is really important. At the same time, it'll be really handy for you as a review, just to actually be able to look back on this at any stage after you've done QPR if you need it as a refresher. So hence we decided to give you the actual recording. So I'm just going to kick off. The first thing is to say that if anything that I say on this would in any way trigger you or make you feel upset, please take a break. Please feel free to give us a call. You'll have our number there. It's 085 2019250. So give us a call or give one of the committee a call or chat to us on Facebook if you feel in any way distressed. Obviously, some of you might be already, I suppose, affected by suicide, whether that's through your own history or through a loved one. And what we always say is don't watch this video and don't interact in the training unless you've at least had, I'd say, between a year and 2 years minimum since you've been last affected significantly by suicide or by mental health. That's for your own well-being, but also because you can only help somebody when you've been fully recovered yourself. And even though you might feel very, very well, your own stuff will come up if it's a thing that you're within that 2-year gap. So please do what's right for the person that you could possibly help, and do what's right for yourself by excluding yourself just for the time being if you have been affected by suicide in the last 2 years. So I'm just going to actually kick off. You'll see me sharing the screen here and things. Any questions that you have, please write them down, jot them down. You'll have an opportunity to interact with a couple of facilitators. It might be myself, it might not be myself. But this will really give you a head start with it and start you off in a good light and give you a good overview before you actually take part in that. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. Just bear with me now. Okay, so we're going to start off here now, and we are going to just watch a video that'll explain a little bit about what QPR is. So if you make sure that your volume is up, there we go.
It may be hard to imagine, but according to the World Health Organization, over 800,000 people die each year by suicide. That is more people than are killed in all the wars and homicides combined. That is one death by suicide every 40 seconds, which means that in the next 10 minutes, 15 people will have killed themselves. Suicide affects every region of the world and is the third highest cause of death for people aged 15 to 44. And for every life lost, another 25 people will attempt suicide, often causing serious medical injury or lifelong disability. This means that each day, roughly 50,000 people try to stop their mental anguish and suffering by ending their lives. And from the very young to the very old, many millions of people think seriously about suicide for days, weeks, and even years. Thinking seriously about suicide is itself a kind of misery index, a sign that something is terribly wrong and needs attention. Most often, what needs attention and treatment is clinical depression, a medical condition that is now the leading cause of disability in the world. In America alone, there are an estimated 15 million sufferers. Most of us are touched by suicide. Some of us have lost family members, loved ones, friends, schoolmates, or colleagues. None of us escapes the loss of people we admire and respect, whether they are people we know or are much-loved musicians, artists, and entertainers. If you have lost someone close to you to suicide, then you already know the considerable cost, the tears and awful pain of loss. And if you are one of the millions who have thought seriously about suicide, then you know just how lonely and terrible it is to suffer alone. Depression, anxiety, substance abuse, bipolar and thought disorders like schizophrenia all contribute to great risk for death by suicidality. Yet most people suffering from a mental illness do not kill themselves. They get help, they find a way, and they recover to live full and productive lives. And if recovery is possible, that means suicide is preventable. Thankfully, the world is changing. We understand mental illness, we understand suicide, and we know that treatment saves lives. Right now, our teachers don't teach us about depression and suicide, and our faith leaders often struggle to talk openly about mental health and suicide. Too often, doctors can't talk to their patients about suicide, even patients who are sitting in their offices planning how to end their lives, perhaps by overdosing on the medication being prescribed to them. The world remains dangerously ignorant about suicide, so to save lives, we must bring this subject out of the shadows. Effective treatment would save thousands of lives around the world. But we must learn to talk comfortably about suicide, and we need your help to start the conversation. Join us in this fight, a fight to save lives. Preventing suicide, it's what people do.
Okay, so that gives you a very brief overview there of what QPR is really, and basically why we feel it's important. And what I always say is suicide's everybody's business. It can be any of our mothers, our sisters, ourselves, our brothers, our fathers, and it's the community that can make a really big difference. That's not to say that, you know, that the professionals don't have a huge part to play. They absolutely do. But the thing is, it can make such a difference for the community to actually be very involved, and just to pick up on the signs of suicide. So what I'd always say is suicide's everybody's business, guys, and that's why we try and roll this out so that it's everyday people that can notice those signs and things, and that'll come clearer as we go through the QPR. So I'm going to go straight to the training, if that's okay. So the first slide, as you can see there, is just tell you what QPR stands for. It's question, persuade, refer, and that'll make a lot more sense as we go on through the topic. So that's the video that I just showed you there. It's derived from America. Now we've put in some statistics in Ireland. Obviously, the founder wanted everyday people trained in suicide prevention in the event of a crisis, kind of like CPR when it comes to in the event of a heart attack. It's not intended to be a form of counselling or treatment, and it is intended to offer hope through positive action. So that's what our aim is. And whether you're a volunteer with the Haven Hub, whether you're just a regular person who wants to know how to respond appropriately to suicide, that's what QPR is all about. Okay, guys, this is just the story of Kevin Hines. It's a video, so if you could just watch it for now, and then I'll discuss what it is, what the reasons are that we actually show this video, because there's two really important messages that we get from it. So just have a look and see what he says. He's really inspirational. You can Google him there on YouTube and things, and you'll see loads about him. He's done amazing work since his suicide attempt. So just going to play this video, and then we'll discuss what we the reason we show it.
We have lost far too many lives traveling the path to this day.
Since 1937, over 2,000 people have died at the Golden Gate Bridge. I feel lucky to be alive every single day. Of the thousands that have died off the Golden Gate Bridge, I am of the 1% who have survived. So I had a great childhood. I thought growing up that everything's going to be great. And then at 17, it all came crashing down. I felt like I was a burden to everyone around me, and I felt that they all hated me and wanted me to die. I wish I asked them if that was the case. They would have all told me otherwise. The night of the 24th, the night before my attempt, I was sitting at my desk writing a note to my mom and dad, and I basically told them in the note how much I loved them. What I couldn't recognize was that I had value. I would find purpose. I would have hope again, but I couldn't see it back then. And at 6 a.m, I entered my dad's room, and he looked at me and he goes, "Kevin, what's wrong?" And I desperately wanted to tell him the truth. I never wanted to take my life that day. I believed I had to. And those are two categorically different things. And eventually I convinced my dad that morning that I was fine, knowing full well that I was going to the Golden Gate and I was going to die.
I got on the next bus. I sat in the very last seat in the middle row. We began to drive out to the Golden Gate Bridge. And that's when it hit me. I realized I didn't want to die at all. I realized that I said, "Well, what are you doing, Kevin? Get off the bus."
I just wanted the pain to stop. That's the common denominator of people we lose to suicide. They just want the pain to stop.
I was walking up to the bus driver hoping that he would see my pain. But I could not say it overtly. I could not tell him to look at me and say, "Hey, kid, are you okay? Hey, kid, is something wrong? Can I help you?"
The bus got to the bridge. I sat there crying. Bus driver turned. He stood. He looked at me and he said, "Kid, come on. Get off the bus. I got to go." I got off the bus. I walked slowly down the walkway to the Golden Gate Bridge. People rode by me, drove by me, walked by me, and a woman approached me. And she said, "Will you take my picture?" She said thanks, and she walked away. It was that moment I just said, nobody cares. The reality was that everybody cared. I just couldn't see it. I ran forward, and using my two hands, I catapulted myself into free fall.
I hit the water. A vacuum opened up and sucked me beneath the water about 70 to 80 feet. My legs were completely immobile. I had shattered my lower vertebrae into shards like glass. But then I opened my eyes. The deep, dark depression that brought me to that day had disappeared. The only thing I wanted to do, needed to do, had to do was survive. I realized I was going down. I shot for what I thought was the surface. As fast as my arms would take me, and I saw the lit water above me, I could see my destination, and I thought, "Well, you're not going to make it. I don't want to drown. I made a mistake." I broke the surface. Barely made it. The Coast Guard arrived. They fished me out of the water, and they started asking me a bunch of questions. The guy looks at me, he leans in, and he says, "Kid, do you know how many people we pull out of this water that are already gone?" And I said, "No, and I don't want to know." And he said, "Well, I'm going to tell you. This unit has pulled 57 dead bodies out of this water and one live one." I want to help people understand that their thoughts don't have to lead them to an attempt. Their thoughts don't have to become their actions when they're suicidal.
You can help change people's lives, okay? That's your goal. That's your life goal. Change people's lives for better, okay? All right, see.
If we do not talk openly about what suicide is, who it affects, and how it affects them, if we do not use the word safely with education and awareness, we run the risk of missing all those people who have it on their minds. But I say to you now, the next time you see someone in obvious emotional distress, I beg of you to walk up to that person and say something to the effect of, "Are you okay?" You can quite literally save a life in that moment.
There's a reason that we always tell the Kevin Hines story in the QPR delivery. And that is simply because, well, there's two reasons. The first reason is how we respond to somebody in distress. So if you remember, Kevin really wanted somebody to ask him, was he okay? So when he got on that bus, he wasn't hoping that he'd meet some fantastic psychiatrist, although no doubt a psychiatrist at some stage or a psychologist played a huge part in his recovery. But that wasn't what he was looking for when he was feeling that low. What he was hoping for was someone to care. He was hoping that somebody would reach out and ask him, is he okay? And when nobody did, and sometimes the reason nobody does is, they feel it's not their business. And you'll talk later yourselves around what might stop you from sometimes asking the question about suicide, and when you notice somebody is in distress. So there's loads of genuine reasons that people don't ask, and a lot of the time it has nothing to do with the fact that they don't care. But to someone who's feeling suicidal, that by responding with silence, that confirms to them that nobody cares. So silence can be often the worst way that you can respond to distress and to suicidal thoughts. So that's one of the first things that we learn about Kevin is that what he desperately didn't need is silence. He needed somebody to ask, are you okay? He really actually wanted that. And the second thing is what we call the ambivalence to live. Now, the ambivalence to live it's a part of the person that no matter how suicidal they are, no matter how determined they are, there's usually a huge part of them that really wants to live. Now, they desperately want the pain to end. And they've obviously gotten to the point where they feel that the only option to end that pain is to end their life. But that's not what they initially looked for. So for Kevin, when his hands left the rails, it showed his ambivalence to live. He instantly regretted it. And as well as that, when he got in the bus and he said, if anyone asks, I won't do it. That's his ambivalence to live. That's the part of him that really wanted to change his mind. And the reason, like in loads of other circumstances, in real life circumstances where, suicide can often happen, we'll see it, albeit all too late, like the tires marks from people that are in one car collisions. The tire marks will show that they last minute changed their mind, but it was too late. The same with the self-inflicted wounds when if someone hangs themselves trying to release themselves, they change their mind. That's the ambivalence to live. The reason that's important is when you're doing QPR, what you're trying to do is you're trying to tap into that ambivalence to live. You're trying to get in touch with that part of them that really, really wants to live. And when we come on to the persuade part, the P, then we'll discuss a little bit more how you do that. But it's really important to remember the Kevin Hines story when we come to that part, because it shows there's always an ambivalence to live in there. It's reaching it and it's growing it. For somebody who's lost a bit of hope, lost a lot of hope a lot of the time. So that's the reason that we share the Kevin Hines story with you. Like I say, it's to say that silence can often be the worst way to respond. And secondly, to tell you that there is an ambivalence to live there, that as QPR gatekeepers, as volunteers, if that's what you're going to be with the Haven Hub, you're trying to get in touch with that part. Okay. So we're going to move on to the next few slides now, if you can bear with me. Now, the next part of the QPR is really all about slides and stuff. So you'll see me going from sharing my screen to just back to me discussing stuff. It's not very long, and like I say, just because you've watched this video does not mean you're QPR trained. You still need to do the part 2. This is just part 1, but it's a really important part. It gives you the complete basis of QPR. So before I do that, like I said at the beginning, some of you, and even no matter how long it's been since you might have had an interaction with suicide, you might learn some skills today that's new to you. And what I would just want to say before we move on to any of those skills is, this isn't about kicking yourself and saying, God, looking back and maybe you've lost somebody through suicide a long time ago, and that's why you're looking to kind of to know how to respond appropriately now. So if you learn something new today, please don't look back and say, God, I should have done this and I should have done that. Don't use this as a stick to beat yourself with. That would be really unfair for you to do. That's not what this is. This is about learning new skills from now. Don't be angry at yourself for skills that you didn't know before. So if you find yourself doing that throughout today's presentation, or when you're doing the part 2 of QPR, then please just like that, be gentle on yourself. And I'm going to share with you what one mum, the way one mum says it. And I say this to all volunteers, and it's actually really important that you hear this, because like that, a lot of us have regrets around how we might have handled things before. We get new information all the time, and we say, God, if I knew that, I would have done this. And we have to be very gentle when we do that. So this mother lost her son through suicide. And I'm just going to share her words with you. And what she said was, and I suppose what she was wondering afterwards is, did I do enough? Was what I said enough? Was what I did enough? And she said, we are only responsible to do what we know to do at the time it needs doing, not for the things that we learn to do later. So please keep that in your thoughts as we go through today's seminar, and as you volunteer in the Haven Hub, that if you learn something new, don't expect your old self that didn't know that skill to have handled it differently. All you can do is work with what you have at the time. So that's really important for all volunteers to know, and for anybody who's going to do QPR. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to do, and I hate statistics, but I'm going to start off with the statistics because these are really good ones. So I haven't that many of them in there, but these are the really important ones. So if you just bear with me now. Okay, so that was the Golden Gate Bridge that we've done. Okay. Now, so one of the first ones here is the peak time for suicide, which is why the Haven Hub opened. The peak time for suicide is 11 o'clock at night. And self-harm or suicide attempts basically is what we're talking about there. So 11 o'clock at night, most of the services are closed, guys. And that's why the Haven Hub opened its doors, is because even though we know that that's the peak time, it's also the time when most services are locked, and that's not a coincidence. So what we wanted to do in the Haven Hub was, I suppose, open an organization where if somebody was struggling, that they would have an option to come and to talk to somebody and get some support in the late hours of the evening. And like that, almost half, which is 44% of presentations, were made between 7 o'clock in the evening and 3 o'clock in the morning, with as I say, the peak time being 11 o'clock at night. So that's something to remember. That's why we have volunteers that give up their free time to come in and to stay late at night, is because that's a lot of the time when you're alone and you feel the whole world is sleeping and you start to struggle. You feel as if, sure, there's no one to reach out to. The doctors aren't there, and you know, the only other place to go, I suppose, would be A&E. And while some people get a lot of help from A&E, a lot of others unfortunately don't, and we'll go through some of that in a while. The next thing there is the statistics. So in 2019, we didn't have them at this point, but I'll tell you some of the 2019 statistics in a while. But in 2018 is when we started to put together these slides. And at that stage, there was 12,588 presentations. And when I give that number, that's the number of people that have actually self-harmed or attempted suicide or been suicidal, who have gone to the hospital and reported that. That's a huge figure. And as you can see there, from 2014 up to 2018, it's constantly increasing. So in spite of all the, I suppose, the mental health campaigns and that, the amount of people that self-harming and attempting suicide from those figures alone will show that it's getting worse. The problem is worsening, and it's increasing year on year since 2013. Now, that doesn't even show the numbers that didn't attend hospital. So we've gotten these numbers from people that have attempted suicide or significantly self-harmed and attended A&E. Loads of people attempt an overdose or various different things. It doesn't work. They get up on the next day and they don't go to the hospital. So it doesn't even include those numbers. So it is startling. It is worrying that it's increasing. Now, the reason there I'm not giving the suicide rate, as in the completed suicide, like these statistics comes from the NSFR, the National Suicide Research Foundation. And that is the most reliable, kind of through the CSO and the statistics, most reliable way of getting the data. On there, you'll see the numbers of that have died through suicide, and the numbers of people that might have attempted it, or what they call the self-harm category. Now, the reason I don't focus too much on the actual completed suicides is, in Ireland, our bar is really high before something is often the verdict is seen to be suicide. Very often, even, you know, a drowning can be classed as drowning rather than suicide, especially if they haven't left a note or if the intention of the person wasn't there. So they might have jumped into the river, but it might be classed as drowning rather than suicide because their intention isn't clear. And similarly, people a lot of the time, another way that some people die through suicide would be autocide, where there's a single car collision. And again, for there, a lot of those would be classed, I suppose, as an accident, as a motor accident. So it's very difficult then to actually give the numbers and give the statistics on the suicide, because the bar is so high for it to be classed. What we can't deny, and what nobody can deny, is the people that end up in A&E saying that my intention was to kill myself. My intention and what I want is to end my life. And that's why we focus more on the self-harm and attempted suicide rates than the actual completed suicide rates. So the rates of self-harm, like this slide here focuses on young people, and I'm particularly worried about young people myself. So as you can see there, from 2007 to 2018, there was a rise of 29%. Like, that's massive. That's a huge increase of the rates in young people aged 10 to 24. It increased by 29% from within those years. And the thing is, Ireland already has a very high rate of suicide for young people. So in UNICEF in 2017, the research shows that we were already the fourth highest rate of suicide. That was in the age group between 15 and 19. Out of 37 countries, we were the fourth highest. So we already have a really high rate, and on top of that, it's growing at an enormous rate. So we really are worried about our young people, and we want to make sure that we start to learn, well, and ask questions as to why the sudden increase and what supports is needed for them. Now, the next slide is kind of just to focus in on Limerick itself, and I feel very passionately actually about what's going on in Limerick. So Limerick had nearly twice the national average of suicide. And like I say, at this stage, the 2019 statistics weren't out, but in 2019, Limerick was the highest rate of suicide, had the highest rate of suicide. So Limerick definitely does have a problem when it comes to suicide. It also, and in my opinion, it's no coincidence, it also has the highest discharge rate after a self-harm presentation of 72%. So 72% of people that go to A&E having significantly self-harmed or having attempted suicide or feeling suicidal, 72% of them are sent home. And on top of that, another 13% leave without even being assessed and without being seen. So, like, the scary part about that then, I suppose, would be the sense of hopelessness that gives to a young, to whether it's a young person or an older person, a person that's feeling suicidal. If the only place that's available to them either can't or won't help them, then it adds to that sense of hopelessness. So when the likelihood is, and as you can see there, 72% are sent home and 13% leave without being assessed, you know, that's 85% of people are not admitted. The next time that person feels suicidal, they might feel, and that's the worry, is there's no point in going out to the hospital because they only send me home and I only end up waiting there, you know, for hours on end to be told to go home. And that sense of hopelessness can be very difficult. So like I say, Limerick in itself has a huge rate of suicide, and we definitely have a problem that like I say, that's the reason I founded the Haven Hub, is because of the high rate of suicide. And I suppose the worry there would be that if unless we change things as a community, and unless the community gets behind change, we're losing our sisters and our brothers and our friends and our mothers. And you know, to me, Limerick people are Limerick's best assets. And unless we come together as a community to try and solve this problem, unfortunately, it looks as though you know, the situation is quite bleak. So we all need to be involved in the changes that's needed to happen to change those statistics. The next one there is about the alcohol links with suicide. So 3 in every 10 people that present to A&E having attempted suicide or self-harm was under the influence of alcohol. So that's quite a high figure, and the reason is that alcohol is a depressant. It makes you more impulsive, it makes you less rational, and less inhibited. So you're going to be more risky, and if you're feeling a little bit suicidal before you drink, and then you drink on top of that, and you add alcohol to the equation, then it's going to be very difficult for you to actually make the right decisions and the right choices. So what you call it, so it's really important. Like, I know in my own recovery, I simply couldn't afford to drink alcohol. So, you know, for anybody that's in recovery, for anybody that's feeling suicidal or anything like that, staying away from alcohol can really help you. Adding alcohol to the equation can make things more difficult. And unfortunately, that again, the dual diagnosis, the link with alcohol, is one of the reasons that sometimes it can be a barrier to getting help, because out in A&E, very often, if suicide, or if somebody has attempted suicide and if alcohol is in the equation, there's huge limits on what help they'll be given in those situations. Some of them won't be allowed to talk to crisis until the alcohol's out of their system. And you know, it's very difficult to actually get admitted if you have alcohol in your system, and to be taken seriously, basically, you know. So in the Haven Hub, we do have, I suppose, policies and procedures around alcohol, but we do believe that even if somebody has a substance abuse issue, they still deserve to be kept safe. They still deserve the help and the support. And as long as we can protect our volunteers while we do that, then we try not to judge people, because alcohol is just a way of somebody's coping. So so that's the alcohol. And just to give you an idea as well of some of the, I suppose, world kind of some interesting facts with when it comes to alcohol, which I found very interesting. So in countries where the minimum legal age to consume alcohol is 18 instead of 21, the suicide rate of teenagers from 18 to 21 is 8% higher. So that shows a direct link between alcohol and suicide. So where alcohol is legal for 18 to 21-year-olds is 8% higher in suicide. And then in Russia, when they increased the price of alcohol, it had a direct reduction on the rates of suicide. So in Russia, they increased the price of alcohol, and then like that, the suicide rate went down accordingly. And again, that shows the direct link between alcohol and suicide. Now, the next thing you'll see here is the male and female suicide rate. And that is, as you can see there, say in 2016, and that wasn't a year that was too different to any of the other years. It's just an example here. So we're just looking at completed suicide rates, suicide here. And in that year, there was 399 suicides. And 79% of them were male and 20% of them were female. And for this one, it's really, really important as to why that is. So what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to leave the others that'll be part of the part 2 of QPR, really talk to you in detail about why that is. For some people, they say that, well, it's because, well, men don't talk as easily, men don't go to the doctor as often and things. And before I did QPR, I would have thought the very same. So, you know, and maybe that is it. So like that, I'm sure you'll have a really good discussion about it. But I'm going to leave that part to, I just wanted to point out to you on it that 80% of those, nearly 80% of those that completed suicide were men, compared to 20% women. Now, to confuse you, I'll just add in there, in the same year, and this is where it'll make you think and where QPR will make you think. In the same year, in 2016, when you look at the attempted suicide rates, 55% of the people that attempted suicide were women, not men. So just have a little bit of a think about, well, okay, well, how come 80% of the people that die through suicide are male? So the majority of them that die through suicide are male. But when it comes to attempting suicide, more women are attempting it than men. And you'll find out the answer to that when you do the QPR, the part 2 of QPR. Hey, just adding a bit in here, guys. The last time that I did these slides for the QPR one, it was, the latest kind of, I suppose, figures that we had would have been 2016, 2017 and 2018. But yeah, 2019 figures has been added on since. So I just want to give the latest figures there. I know 2019 is a while back, but that's just the updated ones that we have. I think COVID kind of had an influence there on their ability to kind of have recorded definite statistics and stuff like that. So yeah, the most updated ones that we have at the moment is 2019. And that's on the National Suicide Research Foundation statistics, which is the most reliable ones that we have. So I'm just going to go through that now, if that's okay. Yeah, starting from the peak time for suicide, guys, it's slightly changed. So it used to be 11 o'clock at night. It's now 12 o'clock midnight is the peak time for suicide. So obviously, again, that's when a lot of places are closed. And yeah, it's increased, so it's later at night, which is why the Haven Hub kind of stays open as late as we do, because that's when people are found to be most at risk, when there's less supports there. The next one you've already seen, so like that, it's just 2019. There was actually a slight decrease in the numbers of less than, but it was by less than 1%. So just to update you on that one. You've already gone through this one, so that's not updated because that was based on a piece of research that was done, UNICEF 2017. Here we had looked at Limerick self-harm and attempted suicide rates. So like that, again, it's 70% and 13%. I think that used to be 72%. So there's a slight decrease in 2019 compared to 2018 of people that are that have self-harmed and are presented suicidal, that have been kind of, I suppose, discharged back into their own care. So yeah, that's reduced, but it's still the highest. So yeah, it's now, in 2019 it was 70%, and in 2018 it was 72%. And in 2019 then, when it comes to alcohol, so yeah, very similar to what it would have been before. So 36% of suicides in men were found to involve alcohol, and 28% in women. So again, that's 3 in every 10. And that just shows the link between alcohol and suicide, and similar to that, to those figures in 2018. And then the last one there to just update you with, it would be the kind of the men versus women that have actually completed suicide. So like that, I think it used to be a 20.2% or something, something like that, yeah. And compared to almost 80% of men. Now it's 78% of men. 78% of those that die through suicide are men, and 22% are women. So a slight decrease for men and a slight increase for women. But obviously, those that complete suicide that are men, the men are still a much higher figure in that. So I just wanted to update you there on the latest figures that we have available to us. And yeah, just to keep things as relevant as we possibly can. Thanks. Now that's the statistics side of it, guys. The next part then, and it looks complicated, but it genuinely actually isn't. It's quite simple. But the next part of it is why people can often get to a place where they attempt suicide. So as you can see on the left there, there's 3 different kind of blocks, I suppose. There's the biological, and that's the stuff that we're born with. So things like your gender, your race, and your age, they all contribute a factor that'll affect whether you become suicidal. Then you have personal or psychological, and what that is that they're kind of your experiences in life, your personal details, as in like if you had trauma. So for me, I got to a place where I was extremely suicidal, and I had a very serious attempt in my life, and I think that's probably why I do what I do, is because I was one of the lucky people that got to the other side and became extremely well. But the reason for me was because of trauma in my childhood, and that I needed to revisit as an adult. And the trauma just came back basically, and it made me extremely suicidal. So that can be an example of something that happens in your life that really affects whether or not you can end up in a place where you feel suicide's the only option. For me, it was the memories. I was going through a trial. My abuser got 18 years when I did, so it was worth going through. But it was a 4.5-year process where the memories of that trauma was just too much to bear, where I got extremely unwell and extremely sick, and I lost hope. I lost the ability to function, to work and various things, and then got to a place where, like that, I felt a burden to other people and things. And I made a couple of attempts on taking my own life. Luckily, very, very luckily, I survived. I spent 6 months in St. Pat's. They were amazing. And I got well. So again, a loss of a parent, it could be any sort of a trauma in your childhood. It could be your culture. Like culture has a big part to play. Like, for example, travelers would have a much higher rate of suicide than others, and that's because in their culture, talking about these kind of things isn't necessarily what their culture believes is, talking about problems and getting some outside help, and for various other reasons. So your culture can play a huge part. And then the third thing there is your environment. And that was kind of new to me, to be honest. I didn't realize the impact it has. But rural versus urban. So if you're living out the country, you can be a little bit more isolated than if you're living in the city. And the season of the year can make a big difference as well. So they're those kind of I suppose factors that can affect you in getting to a place where you're hopeless and that you might attempt suicide. On top of that, usually, but not always, there's usually a trigger, or what we call an acute factor. And that is something that might throw you literally, like, I suppose, throw you over the edge of it, in the sense of, just becomes that little bit too much. So examples of those would be illness. So somebody who's, especially if it's a long-term illness, where they don't want their loved ones to see them slowly and painfully die, they might attempt suicide, in a way to I suppose, just have it over with, and so that others aren't affected in seeing their downfall. Relationships ending can literally be an acute factor or a trigger, on top of these other factors that can lead a person to contemplate suicide. The death of a loved one, especially if that person is died through suicide, the loss of a job, expelled from school, or arrested. So like that, a sense of loss. They'd be some of the acute factors, and you're going to discuss a bit more about them in the next part of QPR as well. And basically, when you combine these factors and then something happens that makes life feel as if you can't cope anymore, whether that's that you lost your job or various different things, or you lost a relationship, or you got ill, you can end up in a place of hopelessness or contemplation of suicide. And when that happens, the difference between those that do end up having an attempt in their lives and those that don't is usually what we call the wall of resistance. And that's this blue wall here. And depending on how thick that wall is, and we'll discuss what makes it thick in a while, will result in whether or not you end up making an attempt in your life. So if you have a very thick wall of resistance, you might only get as far as here. And you might contemplate it and it might come into your mind. But then this wall of resistance, you'll hit it and it'll bounce you back in, But for those whose wall of resistance is quite thin, they will they will often end up where like that, they'll make an attempt in their life, and that can be through poison, through gun, through hanging, drowning, autocide, or jumping. So this wall of resistance here is really, really important, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail on that now. So the wall of resistance to suicide is what I call protective factors. So ask yourself, well, what makes the difference between someone? So the same thing happens to two different people. What makes the difference between the person who'll attempt it and actually attempt suicide than those who actually don't? And very often that's protective factors are at play. So the more of these protective factors a person has in their life, the better it is, and the less chance there is that they'll die through suicide. So you can read through them there. The counselor, so like that, talking therapy can make a huge difference. A duty to others, it can make a difference where you just feel like I couldn't do that to my family, I couldn't do that to my children. Other close people in their lives where they don't want to hurt somebody else, that can be a protective factor. Medication compliance, really, really important. I'm on medication myself. I'll probably always be on medication, and I'm okay with that. It's I'm still working perfectly, functioning fine, but sometimes mental health can be the one area where, unfortunately, and I've done it myself loads of times in my previous history, but where we find a medication that helps us, and then for whatever reason we decide, okay, well, now that I'm better, I'm going to come off of it altogether. I don't need it anymore because I feel better now. And if that was diabetes or any of the other physical illnesses, we would know that, well, I'm feeling better, but yeah, the medication has a part to play. Now, that doesn't mean everybody that has low mood needs medication, but for some of us, medication does play a part. And if we aren't compliant with our medication, we'll become more suicidal and more likely to act on it. Fear is a big one. Fear is a good thing when it comes to suicide, in the sense of being afraid of dying, being afraid of the pain that comes with it. And like one of the examples I give is if I was to talk to somebody that was on the river, like you're so kind of delusional, I suppose, in a way, and that's what draws people to the water a lot of the time when they're feeling suicidal. It definitely was what brought me to the river, was that sense of a kind of painlessly and peacefully drifting off to oblivion, where you're kind of more or less asleep, and that's a delusion. And if I was to meet somebody now, because I did enter the river, I did jump in, and it was the most painful experience I've ever had in my life. It was excruciating, the overcurrents and the undercurrents. If I met somebody on a bridge now that was thinking about it, I would break that delusion by allowing that fear in and say, God, you do know it's so painful and it's so cold in there, and it's one of the hardest ways to go. And that's just me personally. So fear around dying, fear around the pain that comes with it, can often be a protective factor in keeping somebody safe, you know, when they're not afraid to die anymore, when they're not afraid of the pain that they might feel, whether that's through hanging or whether that's through the river or whether that's through an accident in a car, then they're more likely to die through suicide. Good health, if you have good health, you're less likely to die through suicide. Job security, give you a purpose, give you a routine, that kind of thing, give you a sense of worth. Responsibility for children can be a protective factor. Support of significant others. So here you might see it's a different color. So as volunteers in the Haven Hub, this is where we can come in. So support from a significant person, a sense of hope. We can all give each other a sense of hope, you know, and let someone know that, look, if even if you don't have hope right now, I have hope of recovery. And I do. I feel everybody can recover, and holding that hope for somebody can really make a difference. And I suppose enlightening that hope in themselves. Positive self-esteem, letting them know, like, you know, that, like for me, I remember in St. Pat's, they didn't tell me, look, I was worried that, you know, I was affecting my children. I was so sick and I felt like a burden to them. And I felt as if, you know, me being around them was just absolutely dragging them down, and that they would have a much better life if I took their sick mother out of the equation. They'd grieve me, but in a year's time they'd be around all stable people. And in my sick mind, I suppose that's what I fully believed was the right thing for my children. And when I went to St. Pat's didn't by any means tell me, oh no, your children aren't affected. But what they did was they improved my self-esteem. They told me, you know what, you'll make it up to them. You'll get well, and you'll make any hurt that they've had, it'll all be made up to them. You'll make everything okay, and you'll make everything right once you're strong. And what that did is it made me believe in myself. And that's what we need to do, because it's not going to be you that keeps somebody from suicide. It's going to be themselves. So giving them that self-esteem is good. And the next line here, pets, which is, I know, a strange one, but like that, farmers would often go out, and before they'd have a suicide attempt, they'll often make sure that their pets are really looked after and things, because that's like that, a duty to their pets can often be a protective factor. Religious prohibitions. So yeah, well, if I die through suicide, I won't go to heaven. That protected a lot of people in the past. So sometimes that can be a protective factor for some. A calm environment and routine can make a big difference. 12-step programs can make a big difference. I love 12 steps myself. I run a 12-step group for people that have experienced abuse and trauma. It's one of the ones where we don't have kind of the need for a higher power as such. So it's a very humanistic version. But what it does do is it lets I suppose it empowers the person to know that however I became unwell, it's my responsibility to get well again, you know. So however I became sick, it's my responsibility to get well. And it does that through small steps. And I think my first task, I remember in my first 12-step group I went to, it was with, I think, Grow, for people who had mental health difficulties. And I think my first task was to brush my hair every day, because I had gone past the point of even, you know, caring and no routine at all. So it can really help you to just take little tasks every week, and then you move on to steps to really own your own recovery. Because like I say, it's the person themselves that needs to make that recovery, not you and not the support. You need help. You can't do it on your own, but you do need to be able to feel empowered and that's what the 12 steps can often do for people. The removal of means is massively important, the removal of means. It really does reduce suicide a lot. For a lot of people, they have I suppose, a plan in their mind. And when you remove the ability to continue that plan, some of them, they don't have a backup plan. And it can just, even if it's just for now, it can keep the person safe. And again, just some of the examples around the world when it comes to that is very, very interesting. So example, in Sri Lanka, when they banned several highly lethal pesticides, basically the poor people used to die through suicide by inducing the pesticides. So what they did was they banned a lot of the highly lethal ones, and that led to a 50% reduction in suicides. So what they did there is they removed the means. And again, you might have heard the old saying of putting your head in the oven. And that will go back to a time. So in 1955 to 1975, they detoxified domestic gas. And again, that led to a reduction of the annual suicide rate by 19 to 33%. So again, they removed the means, you know, and it made a huge difference in it. So remember that when you're doing your QPR, if you manage to take the means away, it can be it can make a huge difference. And we'll do that through asking them what their plan is. If you want to know more about that, if you go on to meansmatter.org, it focuses a lot more on the effect of removing means as a way to reduce completed suicides. Then, as you can see here, the safety agreement, a treatment plan, that'll give hope. That'll be like, okay, well, we have a plan here of recovery. And then the last thing, as you say, sobriety can be a huge protective factor. Remember the link between alcohol and suicide. So being sober and being with it is really important. So if you want to pause this video and just take a little bit of a break, feel free to do so and then come back to it. But I'm going to motor on if that's okay. So there are the protective factors. So the next thing we're going to move on to there is suicide myths and facts. And we're going to go through them one at a time. So there you can see, once a person decides to attempt suicide, there is nothing anyone can do to stop them. So, you know, the fact around that, so you have to ask yourself, okay, well, do you believe that? Well, the fact around it is that suicide is the most preventable kind of death. Even if they're very, very adamant that they're going to attempt it, if they get the right help, they can absolutely be helped. Otherwise, there's no point in us doing what we do. If we can't make that difference, why, you know, why be here, basically? Like, you know, why even try? So that's definitely a myth that once they've made up their minds, there's nothing that can be done. That's simply untrue. The next one there is confronting a person about suicide will only make them angry. Again, that's not true. They might come across a bit angry at times, you know. A lot of people, like me, when I was suicidal, I wasn't very likable. I was very angry at the world. I was angry at the people around me. But asking me about suicide, because of my history, I'll often be asked to this day, and it's been 4.5 years since my suicide attempt. But even at that, I will still be asked when I'm low by the people who love me, can I check with you? Are you feeling suicidal? The professionals will still ask me. So it never makes me mad, you know. So asking someone about it, if you're wrong, then that's actually the best outcome, is actually, do you know what, they weren't suicidal after all. So try not to be afraid of asking a person about suicide. The fact around it is that asking them will lower their anxiety, it'll open communication and lower the risk of an impulsive act. So a lot of research has been done around this, and the fact around it, and you'll just have to take our word for it, is asking someone about suicide doesn't make them suicidal. So just take that as a sense of, I suppose, reassurance. The next one there is only experts can prevent suicide. And the fact around it is suicide is everybody's business. Unfortunately, if experts had it, then, you know, and they knew everything that there is, then, you know, suicide wouldn't exist. You know, so we wouldn't have a suicidal crisis at the moment. That's not to say that experts don't play a role. They play a huge important role, and we'll get to that when we come to the refer part. But like Kevin Hines, when he got on that bus, he just wanted somebody to care. He wanted connection. So lots of people are capable of making a difference to a person who's feeling suicidal, not just the experts. Next kind of thing that we're going to discuss there would be around the suicidal people keep their plans to themselves. So that's the next thing, and it goes nicely with the one after that, which is those who talk about suicide don't do it. So like that, you have to say to yourself, like a lot of people believe that that if they really wanted to do it, sure, they wouldn't be telling me. And there's a certain amount of rationale that goes with that. Like if they wanted to just die and they, this wasn't a cry for help and stuff, then they would just do it. Whereas if they're telling me about it, that means that, they don't want to do it. And there's a little bit of truth in that. However, it shouldn't give you an amount of reassurance that, okay, well, that means they won't do it. So, like Schneidman did it was 1998. He did some research on it was by some people who have completed suicide. So that these people died through suicide. And when he looked at it, they had actually communicated in the weeks before that they wanted to die through suicide. So just because somebody tells you doesn't mean they won't do it, because all of those people went on to do it, even though, as I say, 90% of them had indicated in some way that they wanted to die through suicide. Therefore, it's really important that that we remember that we need to take all signs seriously. And even if somebody, and that's where it comes in, I suppose, where it's difficult, if somebody has repeatedly felt suicidal, every time they feel suicidal and they admit they're suicidal, that needs to be looked at and taken seriously on its own. It really does. The next thing there is a suicidal person just needs to think more positively and stop attention seeking. So on that one, and I'm sure like that for anybody that like obviously wants to help people suicidal, that might be something that you've heard before. I've certainly heard it loads of times. That person's only looking for a bit of attention, when they're saying they're feeling suicidal. And sometimes it's not even said as meanly, I suppose, as that. Like, for example, and I give the example of my own dad, who I absolutely adore and love to bits. But a man who kind of, I suppose, never, I don't know if he ever struggled with depression, but never really understood depression or anything like that, or low mood and things like that. And he'd often say to me with absolutely the best intentions, because he loved me like more than most people would love me. He was my dad. He still does, obviously, but yeah, one of the things he used to always say to me was, look, Leona, you can wake up in the morning and you can either choose to be happy or you can choose to be miserable. You can look at all the things that are wrong in your life, or you can look at all the things that's right in your life. And I hope, Leona, someday that you wake up and you start making the right decision there, because you've a lot going right for you. Now, when he said that, he meant it well. And what effect it had was it actually made me feel, and he obviously never meant to do that, it made me feel as if I didn't really have the right. I didn't have the right to feel as bad as I felt. So it's really important like that you, I suppose, get to a place where if you're trying to understand it, that you understand what depression does to the brain, and that seeing the positives isn't a choice. So the best way to show you that is through an actual picture. So as you can see here, the left is the picture of a person who's kind of had depression and has become suicidal over a period of time. And the right then is the brain of somebody who has not been affected by depression or suicide. And as you can see, there's huge changes, there's huge differences. So the brain in size actually shrinks. Okay, so that's one of the things. The prefrontal cortex is really affected as well. And then, like you see here, the gray matter in the brain, that's the part of your brain that's responsible for problem solving, that's responsible for thinking rationally, that's responsible for seeing the consequences of your actions. That's the part of your brain that sees different options. And when you're suicidal, that part of your brain is really, really reduced. And so you can't see it's not that you can't physically see them. You can probably see them, but you can't feel the positives in your life. You can't see the other options available to you besides suicide. Sometimes, you can't, problem solve your way out of it because your brain is affected. So what many people just don't understand then is like that's the reason why a person can't just choose to be more positive. And it's not always about attention seeking at all. It's that their brain has changed, and it is an actual physical illness a lot of the time. And it's a response. It's a response sometimes to trauma, sometimes to depression, for various different reasons that we discussed. It's a response. So depression changes the physical structure of the brain and the nervous system, and the person's inability to see the positives or get themselves out of their depression isn't their fault. So that would help people to kind of understand it a little bit better. And the next thing we're going to do there is look at some of the clues and the warning signs. And like I say, no matter what, you're asked to take all signs seriously. So the first there is what we call direct verbal clues. So obviously, how would you, here we're going to look at, well, how would I know somebody is suicidal? So one way is obviously that they say something that makes you wonder if they're suicidal. And what I'd ask you to do when I look at these signs is take any sign as what I'm going to call an invitation. So there's another suicide prevention I suppose training. It's called Assist. It's fantastic. I'd encourage everybody to do it. It really goes into a lot of depth as well. It's 2 days long, and that's where we get the word invitation from. So invitation is like a sign. It's an invitation for you to check if they're suicidal. And a lot of the time, people that are suicidal, they're giving these invitations. They don't even realize that's what it is. And they can do it in many ways. And we're going to look at them and like that. They're signs and they're invitations. They can be verbal. It can be something somebody says that makes you in your gut say, I wonder if they're saying this because they're feeling suicidal. That's a sign. That's an invitation. And what way can that often sound? So obviously it can be very direct. They can tell you straight out. And there's some examples there. You're in no doubt about it. I've decided to kill myself. I wish I were dead. I'm going to commit suicide. I'm going to end it all. If such and such doesn't happen, I'll kill myself. That's somebody giving you a sign. That's somebody giving you an invitation. And that invitation is an invitation for you to ask the question. And we'll discuss what the question is in a few minutes. Other times it's indirect. So think about what you'd be looking out for somebody. What does somebody who might be suicidal say that they're kind of subtly giving you a hint that that's the place they're in? So here are some examples. I'm tired of life. I just can't go on. My family would be better off without me. When I'm gone, you will have to look after your mother. I just want out. I won't be around much longer. Pretty soon you won't have to worry about me. What I'll ask you is to see all of those, and I'm sure there's many, many others that you'll discuss in part 2 of QPR. See any of those as an invitation. It's an invitation for you to ask the question, and it's really, really important. So, so they're the indirect and the direct ways that people can tell you that suicide's in the room, okay? And the next then I'm going to look at is sometimes it's the way they're behaving. Sometimes they haven't said anything at all. It's the way they're behaving that makes you think it. And when you think of their behavior, I want you to remember that the most serious and powerful predictor of death by suicide is a previous suicide attempt. So I've gotten a lot of, personally, I've gotten a lot of help. I continue to get a lot of help because I do struggle with depression. Because I've attempted suicide and because they've been serious attempts, no matter how much help I get, the fact that I've already tried it means that I'm way more at risk than anybody else, than people who has never tried it. I'd be a lot more at risk because of that, because the most serious, powerful predictor of death by suicide is a previous suicide attempt. So when you're looking at signs, if you know that person has attempted suicide before, then I'd ask you to take it even more seriously. I'd ask you to really, believe your gut if your gut is saying, I think there's something not quite okay here. And all it is you're going to ask the question. I'm not saying you're going to make a decision that that's what it is. We're going to talk about how you ask the question. But these are invitations. So acquiring a gun, obviously, or stockpiling pills might be another behavior that you see. Co-occurring depression, moodiness, and hopelessness. Putting personal affairs in order. Now, any of those on their own may not be, okay, an indication of suicide, but maybe it's that together with other behavioral clues and that the person has said something. So sometimes it's a combination. Giving away prized possessions. So like that, they might have a dog that, or a car or something they feel really, really passionately about. And suddenly they're saying, oh, I just can't look after my dog anymore. That would be kind of a sign. Again, putting it with other things that's going on might be a sign of suicide. That suicide's in the room and they're contemplating it. Sudden interest or disinterest in religion. Again, it's a change. So if the person was always interested in religion, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily more or less suicidal than that they are. But if there's a sudden change, somebody who never spoke about religion starts talking about Jesus or Buddha, or whoever the case, whatever the case may be, it might be because they feel they're going to be there soon, and that might be it. Might be because they're very unwell, or if they were always interested in religion and suddenly they're not going to mass and they're not praying and they're angry at God. That might be a sign. So a change in that might be a sign, because maybe their religion teaches them that that suicide's a sin, and so they distance themselves from it. Drug or alcohol abuse or a relapse, sometimes really hard for people who have struggled with addiction to accept a relapse. And sometimes that in itself can throw them over the edge. Or sometimes the fact that they've relapsed might be just a sign that they're beyond caring. So something that they've worked really hard at, they feel they're not going to be around long for too much longer anyway, and they don't care anymore. So a relapse, would be a behavioral clue. And again, I'd ask you, if you see any of those, look at them as an invitation for you to ask the question. And again, unexplained anger, aggression, and irritability. Again, not on its own, that mightn't necessarily mean suicide, but it can often be a behavioral clue. So that's things that people say. And then there's things that people can the behavior that they might show. And then the last thing is situations that you might be looking out for. And we touched on that earlier when we looked at acute factors. So situational clues are triggers. So if you know that someone has been fired or expelled from school, and like that, you see some of the other signs, if they've a recent unwanted move, the loss of any major relationship, the death of a spouse, a child, or a best friend, especially if by suicide. The diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness, the sudden unexpected loss of freedom or a fear of punishment, anticipated loss of financial security. Maybe that's how they valued themselves and they think they've no value anymore. The loss of a cherished therapist or counselor or teacher, and the fear of becoming a burden to others. So that was my big one, was the fear of becoming a burden to my children, because I didn't think I'd ever become well. And what I'd always ask you to do when it comes to the situational clues is never judge, because we're all built with different coping mechanisms, different abilities, to different resiliences. So the same thing can happen to two different people, but remember, they're made up of different factors. So just because you don't think something is serious enough that it would make a person suicidal, don't judge that for another person, because two people, the same thing might happen, but they respond very differently and they cope very differently. So say losing a job, for example, two students lose a job. For one person, it might be a case of, oh, well, look, there's loads of jobs out there and it just means I have to cut back a bit. For another person, it might set them into a state of worry where they think, oh my goodness, without this, I can't pay for my rent. I'll have to leave my course. I can't continue on with college and my future is jeopardized. And it might make them extremely depressed and unwell. So the same event can happen to two different people, and there's no right or wrong, but they could cope with it very, very differently. So just try not to judge. But if you know somebody who's gone through any of those situations, what we say is, see that as an invitation. If it's combined with other behavioral or verbal clues or signs, then maybe consider, do I need to ask the question? And we'll move on to what the question is now shortly. Before we tell you about the question, just a couple of tips around it. So if you're in doubt, don't wait, ask the question. Okay, so asking the question is always the right thing to do. If the person is reluctant, be persistent. Sometimes somebody will say no, but you hear yes, your gut is saying yes. If that's the case, circle back to that question maybe later and trust your gut a bit, and find another way of asking them later on. An example of that would be if in the haven hubs, the patrol teams drag somebody off the side of the river and they bring us to the haven hub, and we ask them the question, are they suicidal? Even if they say no, their behavior is telling us yes, they were just dragged off the side of the river in a distressed state. So don't always be so quick to believe them, and it's not about saying I don't believe you. It's often about it's very often just about kind of making them feel safe enough that they feel like the right thing to do is to tell you. Try to talk to them in a private setting if you can, giving yourself plenty of time. Take all signs and cues very seriously. Know where to refer them to. You're only as helpful as what you know the services are out there. And this is really important part. You're not going to bring somebody from the stage of feeling suicidal to being very content in their life. Likelihood is they'll need a lot more services to get them to that place. That's not your aim. So you need to know support services to be able to help them with that. And that's the refer part. You're just looking to keep them safe for now and give them a bit of hope that with the right help, they can turn it around. But you're not necessarily going to be the one that does that for them. They're going to do that for themselves. They're going to do that through probably a combination of factors that they'll introduce into their lives. And just remember that how you ask the question is less important than the fact that you ask it at all. Okay, so we will look at ways that we suggest that you don't ask the question, and ways that we suggest you do. But the fact that you ask it at all is the real important thing. Remember, silence is probably the worst way to respond to suicide. And then when it comes to asking the question itself, what is the question? So the question is very often, you're going to use the word suicide. What you're really trying to find out is suicide in the room with this person? So you have figured out already that they've given you an invitation or a sign, okay? And now you wonder if suicide's in the room. How do you check with them if it is? So I would always say to use the direct approach, okay? However, if you're on a bus and you see somebody is a little bit upset, they might have just broken up with their boyfriend or their girlfriend. It might be very different, it may not be appropriate for you to actually to go over and to approach them and to say, sorry, can I just check there, are you suicidal? That might not be the way to start off that conversation. So that's where the less direct approach can come in handy, because it builds into the direct approach. So you might start off with the less direct approach and then get into asking the question in a very direct way. That would always be my advice. So the less direct approach, you might say something like, have you been struggling lately? Have you been very unhappy lately? Can I check with you? Have you been feeling unusually low or down? Have you been finding it hard to cope? Can I check if you've any thoughts of hurting yourself? They're all ways they're the less direct approach. And while they'll indicate to you where the person's mind might be, and that they'll open up conversations, and they're really helpful to that degree, so they're worth noting. They don't answer the question as to whether they're thinking of ending their lives. Even the thought there of, have you thoughts of hurting yourself? If the person struggles and they cope with self-harm, as in cutting, but they might not want to die. It's very different how you're going to have to, I suppose, respond to a person who's having thoughts of self-harm in the sense of cutting, compared to a person who actually wants to kill themselves. So you need to know what you're dealing with before you know how to respond appropriately. So while all those can be really good ways of opening up the conversation so that it is appropriate to ask them in a direct way, they're not in themselves going to ask them. So I'm going to give you the example. And usually, like I say, the important thing about asking the question is it needs to be brief. It can't be vague, so it needs to be direct. Okay. And you should try and use the word suicide if you can at all. Suicide or killing yourself, so that the person knows exactly what you're asking. Use the kind of wording that's familiar to you. So this is worth practicing, and like that. That's why in the part 2 of QPR we do a lot of role play, because you know, I know lots of people that are very direct in the way their approach is anyway, and they just say things very bluntly, and that's okay. You know, if they were to kind of ask in a very in a way that I might ask, then it kind of nearly feels it feels very awkward, you know, because that's not in their personality. Whereas they might turn around and say something like, "Can I check? Are you thinking of killing yourself?" You know, and that's okay. That is a direct approach, and we'll move on to that now. So here you can see, are you thinking about killing yourself is here. So it's okay to ask that. That's perfectly fine. If that's kind of what way you'd normally come across to somebody, stick with that. That's going to answer your question. Are you having any suicidal thoughts? Again, that's another way to say it. If you're a bit nervous about it, it might be like, look, sometimes when people are finding it hard to cope for a long time, they have thoughts of wanting to end it. Can I check, do you have any of those thoughts? Okay. So that's another way, and that's a really good way of asking. The last way here is how I often try and suggest that people would ask. So the difference here is you would have heard an invitation. So you would have seen a sign. And what you're going to do is you're going to feed that sign back to them. You're going to repeat that sign to them. And you're going to say, let's say, for example, the sign was a verbal sign. So they've given me this invitation because they've said, I just want to give up. Okay. And I then wonder, you know, is that an invitation? Should I ask the question? And I do. Okay, so how I'll ask the question then is I'll repeat that invitation to them and then ask. So I hear you say there that you just want to give up. Can I check if you mean by that, are you feeling suicidal? By doing that, you're letting them know why you're asking, and you're asking the question straight out. So you're making it very easy for them to say, actually, yes, I do. The note there is very important as well. If you can't ask the question, just go and find someone who can. The next thing we're going to look at there is how not to ask the question. So like I say, asking the question at all is really good, but there's a couple of ways that we try to avoid. Kind of the negative way of asking of, you're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? Don't ask that way, because that's letting them know that, look, I'm really hoping here that you say no. And the thing is, you probably are really hoping that they say no. And you're hoping that they're not suicidal. But by asking them in that way, if you're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? That's really letting them kind of indicating to them, I really want your answer to be no. And the thing is, if their answer is yes, you really want to know. Okay, so you're not going to ask in that way. And again, this is probably a kind of generational thing. You're not thinking of doing something stupid. Don't try not to ask like that, because it's judgmental. It's making it more difficult for them to admit, yes, you know, what are they supposed to say? Yes, I am thinking of doing something very stupid. Make it easier for them to admit it if that's where they're at. So try to avoid saying, look, you're not thinking of doing something stupid, are you? And that's just a generational thing. We don't mean it to sound like that. So, you know, just to be aware of it. And similarly, the word commit, like we commit sins and we commit crimes. People die through suicide. So try, the word commit comes from a time when it was against the law and it was against your religion, and you'd use the word commit. So the best way to kind of correct yourself on that is every time you use the word commit suicide, try to correct yourself. That's what I did for a long time, and thankfully now I kind of, I'm out of the habit. It's, you know, it's just a habit. So but we do need to get out of it. So try to avoid the word commit. And then the last thing there is kind of what I would call silver lining things, in the sense of you know, either that suicide's a dumb idea, surely you're not thinking of suicide, or what I'd often hear is, oh, sure, you have a lovely house and you've 3 amazing kids, like surely you wouldn't think of suicide. The silver lining part, don't make it very difficult for them to admit it, because that's going to end up with them feeling as if I don't even have the right to be feeling this way, you know. So there's some of the ways that you'd need to avoid asking the question. And again, just to remember that the right ways to ask them would be the direct way. Are you having any suicidal thoughts? If that's all you can take from how you ask the question, just remember that. My personal favorite, as I say, is to feed back the invitation. I hear you say there that you just want to give up. Can I check if you mean by that, are you feeling suicidal? That's perfect as well. Are you thinking about killing yourself? Any of those direct questions, but you're not bringing in a negative or any sort of a judgmental attitude. The next part is to persuade, and we persuade people to do things every day that they don't start off wanting to do. For anybody who's been married, maybe it's a case of persuading somebody to paint the wall blue instead of painting it grey, or it might be persuading the kids to do their homework now so that they have the rest of the evening to themselves. We persuade people all the time. And the thing to remember with persuade is, what are we persuading them to do? We're trying to persuade them to choose life over death, to choose to recovery instead of suicide. Okay. And how you persuade them is, I suppose, firstly, just tell yourself that you're trying to persuade them to do something they want to do anyway. And that's really important. Think about the ambivalence to live that we spoke about. There is a part of them that really wants to stay alive, and you're just trying to persuade them to do something they really want to do anyway. Before we even get to persuade, and P is for persuade, can I just say that there's something really important after you've asked the question. So let's say you've asked the question and the answer is yes. You've asked, are you thinking of killing yourself? And the person says yes. I'd have an answer ready. What I normally say is, I'm really glad you told me that. It must be really hard to admit. What that does is, by telling them, by telling the person that, that you're glad that they said it, it kind of reassures them a little bit. And it also gives you a little bit of a space, because inside you might be panicking a little bit, saying, oh my God, they're suicidal. What do I have to do again? So by reassuring them, so you've seen the invitation, you've asked the question, and then just reassure them and say, I'm really glad you told me that. Must be really hard to admit. And before you get to the P with the persuade, I'd ask you to ask like that, asking their plan. So the reason that ask their plan, it can be really important, is like we talked about the removal of means. And if you can remove the means, you can keep them safe. So when you're asking their plan, you're not looking for the gory details. You're not being nosy. You're trying to keep them safe. And you'll go on to keep them safe when you know their plan. So for example, if their plan is that they've collected all their medication and they're storing it under the mattress, you might go on to ring their family, and later on, which we'll get to, and you might be going on to persuade them to give you their phone number and to leave their family know, so that their family can go with them to the hospital or stay with them at home. But when you know their plan, you can turn around and you can say, well, their medication is under the mattress, and that's how they're planning to do it. So, the same with, oh, well, if you find out that their plan is with a rope, and that they've bought the rope and the rope's in the shed, by disarming their plan, you can keep them safe. And that's not a breach of, like, you're always going to breach confidentiality to keep a person safe. Safety has to come first. So that's the reason you're asking the plan. And like that, I would always ask it after the person admits it. There's never a nice time, because it's not a nice question to ask. So I'd ask about their plan straight away, kind of after they've admitted they're suicidal. So this is the kind of the sequence. So you've seen the invitation, where you've thought to yourself, God, I wonder, now that they've said that, if they're feeling suicidal. You've seen the invitation, you've asked the question in a direct way, and they have admitted that they're suicidal. You then reassure them and you say, I'm really glad you told me that. It must be difficult to admit. And then straight away I would ask, can I check with you? Have you thought about how you would do it? Do you have a plan? Now, sometimes they don't have a plan, and that's okay. And they say, no, I haven't really thought about that. That's nearly a good thing sometimes. Might mean that you have a bit more time on your hands to try and keep them safe. Sometimes they have a very definite plan. And the best way you can help keep them safe is to disarm that plan. So you're going to ask details. So like that, if they say, well, I'm storing the medication, you're going to go on to ask, can I check with you when it comes to that medication, where have you stored it? And, really try and get them to give you the information, so that like that, you can help keep them safe. If their plan is to die through drowning, and, they say, well, the river, I just feel is very peaceful. And let's say that they then like leave your company and they just won't stay with you, and they just panic and they leave, then at least you can turn around and you can ring the patrol teams, and you know that that's their plan. You can ring the Gardaí and say, God, you know, there was somebody here with me, they said they were suicidal, they were thinking about drowning themselves, and I'm really worried they're gone to the river, and they'll send a patrol team down there. You can keep them safe. That's the reason that you're going to ask about their plan. So again, you're going to do is you're going to see the invitation. You're going to ask, you're going to see the invitation, you're going to ask the question, you're going to reassure them that you're glad that they told you, and then you're going to check out their plan. Okay, so that's kind of all coming through the question part. Okay, and you can like that, write that down, write that sequence down. You'll also get that by email as well. And then you come on to the next part, which is the P for persuade, which is after the plan. I always say there's 2 P's, but in QPR there's actually only one. There's question, persuade, refer. But in the question part, you're also going to question their plan. So that's how you'd remember that. So we're just going to go back to persuade, and remember, you're persuading them to do something that they want to do anyway. So I'm going to go back in here. So you're going to listen to their story, and this might take time. It's really important here that they're doing 80% of the talking. You know, suicide comes with energy, and if you can get that energy out by listening to them, a good way to do that would be to say, tell me more about that, you know. So, you know, listen to their story, and making sure that it's not you doing all the talking is really important, that you're listening to them and that you ask them relevant but not nosy questions, you know. Giving them your full attention, active listening skills is really important. And you know, if you're becoming a volunteer with the Haven Hub, you do a lot of training around that. Try not to judge, and try to stay neutral. And I'll discuss that in a little bit more detail now in a second. Remember that suicide is not the problem, only the solution to a perceived unsolvable problem. And remember that ambivalence to live. They really want to live anyway. You know, they want to live, and you're just trying to get in touch with that. You need to offer hope that any problem can be helped with the right supports. And if they have no hope, then you reassure them that you hold enough hope for both of you. What are you trying to persuade them to do? You're going to try and persuade them to basically, like that, stay safe. You're going to try and persuade them to choose safety and recovery instead of death by suicide. And how are you going to do that is going to be dependent on your relationship with them. So if you have, so when it comes to persuade, like I said, you're trying to persuade them to stay safe. How you're going to do that is going to differ depending on the situation. So for example, in the Haven Hub, a lot of the time, we want their families involved, because their families will stay with them out in A&E, you know, whereas if they go out themselves and if they decide to leave and they're unsafe, then, you know, that then likelihood is there's going to be nobody there to stop them. Sometimes if A&E isn't the answer, the family might stay with them and stay awake with them to make sure that they keep themselves safe. The family can obviously call the emergency services if needed. Sometimes when you're trying to persuade the person to give you the phone number of the family, that, you know, they really don't want to. Their reasons will differ. Sometimes it's because they feel as if there's nobody that cares. Sometimes it's going to be because they don't want to disturb that person. They feel that they're already too much of a burden. So you need to be really clever in the way that you persuade them. Persuading them, you know, will always work better when you just take the human approach. So for example, I'd often say, like during the telling of their story, they might have mentioned somebody that really cares about them. So you might ask them, well, is there anyone at home that we could contact? And they might say no. And then, you know, like that, you'll remember people they might have mentioned, and you might say, well, what about your sister? What about your sister Mary? And they might say, no, Mary's at home in bed and she's kids and stuff. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with saying, look, if Mary, if I was your sister, I'd really want to know. I'd want to be woken out of my sleep. And if you were feeling like that, I'd want to know. And if Mary was in with us here, and if you were at home in bed, would you want Mary to know? I'm sure you would, you know. So that kind of human approach can really be very effective in persuading the person to come round to thinking that they're worth the effort that it's going to take for their family to get involved. Sometimes when it's the emergency services, again, I can irate them and make them annoyed if you feel like, because if their family, sometimes their family won't come. And that's the thing, is you could ring them and their family might, this might be somebody who's repeatedly gotten into this situation. A lot of the times, you know, we've broken links with our family and our friends when we get to the stage of crisis. So if their family either doesn't come, or if they won't give the phone number, then likelihood is you're going to have to ring emergency services. And if you do, then firstly, I wouldn't necessarily tell them that you're going to ring emergency services until they're nearly there, because otherwise they'll just leave. And if they do leave, then you need to probably ring the patrol teams in case they go down by the river, and you might need to ring the guards and explain that you have had someone there that was actively suicidal, that they've left, and that you're worried about them, because you don't have the right to put your hands on them no matter what. So assuming that you just need to tell them that you've had to ring for an ambulance or ring for the emergency services, the best way to do that would be to say, look, if I was feeling how you're feeling, would you let me go home by myself right now? And a lot of the time they'll say, no, you wouldn't, you know. If I'd be, you know, to let them know that you'd be really worried about them. Look, you're after telling me there you were suicidal. And even if now you no longer feel suicidal, something else could change when you go home. You could get a nasty text. You could, you know, not be able to sleep and stuff. And I'd be too worried about you. So I'm, you know, you deserve to be kept safe, and I want you to be kept safe, and I care about you. And that's how you bring someone around to the terms of, you know, of actually feeling as though, yeah, the right thing to do is to get the emergency services involved. And like I say, a lot of the time saying, if it was me, would you leave me go home on my own? Like the last time I used that, like the person kind of half laughed and said, you know, you caught me there. No, I wouldn't. And so then they'll kind of see it from that, rather than turn around and say, well, you've said you're suicidal and the policy is that we have to ring emergency services, because that feels colder. So they'd be some of the tips that I'd give. And like that, obviously, if it's your cousin or if it's your sister, you might be willing to do that a little bit more. You know, we'd never, in the Haven Hub, we'd never go with them in the ambulance. We would never be able to kind of, you know, go, we'd never be able to put our hands on the person or anything like that. When it's your sister, you know, even if you're looking to kind of for them to agree something, you might be saying, will you go there with me? And that might be what you're persuading them to do then. Versus if you're a volunteer, it might be to let you contact their family. And like I say, it's only through letting them know that you care about them is really the way to get them to kind of come around to thinking that, you know, yes, I want your help. Remind them that, you know, you're not looking for them to choose to live forever. You're just asking them to keep safe for now, and that you hold enough hope, you know, for the both of you, that things can get better, and can they just keep themselves safe and do what's needed to just keep themselves safe for now. I've often said, you know, the river will still be there in 3 weeks or 4 weeks time. You know, nobody can take that away. Nobody can really take a right away to never ever die through suicide. But I wonder, would you be able to just give it a chance of those couple of weeks and see, can we get you the right help? That's persuade. The other thing I'd say about persuade is like that, if you are ringing the emergency services, or if you're ringing the family, maybe not to do that in front of them, maybe to step outside the room, because that can be hard for them to overhear you describe what's going on. And before you persuade them, at the stage where you're listening to their story, staying neutral is really important. So let's say, for example, they're angry. Like when I was suicidal, I was angry at everybody. I was angry at me. I was angry at the world. I was angry at my family. And that's coming from a distressed place, and you're only hearing one side. So be very careful that no matter what you hear, that you don't take sides. You need to take a very neutral stance. And even if what you're hearing sounds as if the other person is pretty awful, you're still going to stay as neutral as you can, for the simple reason that if they're very close to that person, that could be the very person that you're ringing to come and collect them later. So say, for example, if they're angry at their sister, you know, you're not going to go along and add fuel to their fire and say, God, that was horrible of your sister, no matter what happened. You're not going to make them more angry. because it could be the sister that you go on to ring, and you don't want to interfere with that relationship. Similarly, you are there to be on their side. So, you're not going to play devil's advocate and ask them in any sort of a way to look at it from their sister's point of view. Like, that would be more counseling down the road. You're not looking for that. You're there for them to validate how they feel. So validating their feelings, a big part of it. And a really good way to do that, for example, in that example would be, I can hear that, you feel very let down, and you feel really disappointed about what happened with your sister, and you feel very unsupported. That must be really hard for you. Do you want to tell me a bit more about that? Leave them do the talking. That's in no way judging the sister. That's in no way telling them they don't have the right to feel angry or upset. It's letting it out, but it's not playing devil's advocate, and it's not at the same time adding fuel to the fire. And that's what you need to avoid. That's the neutral place you need to avoid. So validate how they feel. So tell me more about that. That must be hard. And I'd say that with a service as well. So sometimes it might be, and I'm going to give an example, it could be Tavere House. I've never dealt with Tavere House. That's why I'm giving that example. And let's say that you know a lot about Tavere House and that you're very angry at them and you have your own personal views on that. You're not gonna take away their confidence in that service, so even no matter what your views are, you're going to take a very neutral stance on it. Neither are you going to back up that service. You're going to very much say, I hear you say you don't feel that they're meeting your needs, and that must be really hard for you, that you don't feel that they hear you. Because at the end of the day, that service might be the ones to give them the prescription or various different things that you can't provide. So there's some of the tips that I would always give you when it comes to persuasion. And like that, you're persuading them to do something that they already want to do. You just need to get in touch with that part. During that persuasion, you'll find a lot of the time what we'll call a connection for life. A connection for life is like a glitter of hope. So it might be a very quick thing. Like they might say, well, I don't talk to any of my family except my brother Michael. Me and Michael get on grand, but everybody else we don't get on. Like they have no time for me. They don't, I want you to grasp that thing. Okay, there's a brother Michael in the picture here. And you mightn't, it's not about silver lining it. So it's not like you're going to ignore the negatives. Leave them space to talk about the other family if they want to and all of that. But you are always going to kind of note in your head that glimmer of hope. There was a little bit of good there. There was something kind of positive there. And you are going to circle back to that. That might be that they play guitar. It might be that their fate, and how you'll know a connection for life is usually that, when they start talking about it, their whole kind of demeanor changes a little bit. And you're going to spend some time at some stage really trying to connect with that part, because that's the part of life that they still feel good in, and that can be playing the guitar. It could be the soccer that they love. It could be their dog. It could be a person in particular that they love. It could be a nephew, and like that. Tell me a bit more about your nephew, and that kind of a response will get them in contact, and that'll be good for their mental space while they're in that suicidal place, to connect with the parts that are actually not going wrong, and you need to do it in a very subtle way, because you don't want to silver line what's gone wrong for them. So you're just doing it so that they can have that connection. Sure, wouldn't it be great now if, let's say, their nephew is going to make their communion? Wouldn't it be great now if we got you to a place where you were feeling well again and you were able to go to that communion, or, if their sister's birthday was coming up, wouldn't it be amazing now if you got a little bit of help and you were able to celebrate that with her? That's kind of where you're going to go towards, so finding that connection for life is really, really important. Sometimes it's very hard to find. Don't worry about it if you've really looked and you just can't find that glimmer of hope. Sometimes if they're in a very, very dark space, there's nothing positive that'll come out of what they have to say. And if that's the case, it just means it might be a little bit harder to persuade them, but it's not impossible, so most times you'll find something that they, whether it's their children or something. So that's the persuade. You persuade them to pick to stay safe, and you try to connect them to their connection to life. That's turning the tide, as you say. And then the very last part of QPR is the R. Now the R is refer. And even though I'm not going to talk very long about refer, refer is actually probably the most important part. So refer is, like I said earlier, you're not going to take the person from a place of wanting to end their life to a place where they are very content in their lives. There's a lot of work in that process, you know. You're possibly going to play a part where you keep them safe for now, and then you need to link them or connect them to another service. And you're only as helpful to them as the knowledge you have around the services available. You're going to want to make sure that service matches their need. So, for example, if they have addiction issues, there's certain services like Pieta House, for example, that wouldn't necessarily be able to deal with anybody that's in addiction. So you don't want to set them up to a support that actually won't be able to meet their needs because of their own personal circumstances. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you now on our website. We've done extensive work on the local services that's around. We've categorized them into what the different issues will be. So having heard their story, you're going to know what their issues, what the underlying issues might be. A lot of the time it can be a simple thing like loneliness. It could be that they're lonely and they're bored, they've lost their job or something, and doing a course or doing a wellness course would help them. It's not just a case of handing them over. It's not a case of tag you're it. If you can, try and stay in contact with them, whether that's through follow-up requests. If you're a volunteer with the Haven Hub, it's a case of, when they leave, just saying, look, is it okay if I check in with you in a couple of days? And once you have their permission, then you fill out what's called a follow-up request. Obviously, if it's somebody that then you're just going to make sure that that's not the last conversation you have with them for a while. Just stay in contact with them. They're going to be embarrassed when this crisis is over, but as well as that, they're going to lack the energy. So it's going to take a lot of energy for them. Their families are also exhausted because their families will have been through this as well. And what happens is there's a lull after the crisis of, oh, well, that's over now, and well, we'll just move on and we'll try to get back to how it was. But a lot of the time, if they've been in crisis, that means that there's some piece of work there that they might need to do. Now, like I say, that could be a simple thing like loneliness and getting some loneliness supports involved. That might be a thing of addiction and getting addiction supports involved. A support group might be a good idea for them. But talking to them about the supports is another piece of work, and that's the refer part. And in order for you to be able to do that effectively, you need to be very, very familiar with what supports is out there. So obviously we're focused on Limerick and the surrounding areas. And I've done a lot of research into what supports are there, putting them in those kind of categories. So what you need to do is kind of really spend some time looking at them and make sure that, like that, if it's somebody, for example, that comes in and they're from the LGBTQ community, do you know the supports that you'd recommend? If it's somebody that comes in, they're from the traveling community, do you know what supports you'd recommend? If they have addiction issues, what supports you'd recommend? That kind of thing. So I'm going to show you quickly how it's done. But obviously, as I said, this is the part that actually needs a lot more work than any of the others, because you need to know your background information on them. And what's really important, as I said, is the limits to those supports. So it's pointless telling them to ring somebody on a Friday afternoon if if that service is only open Monday to Wednesday, for example. So that the limits, depending on what the circumstances are. So I can share my screen, and like I say, there's also the HSE website that you can check out different services on that. I'm just showing you the Haven Hub here as an example of a way that you can do it. So so this is the kind of database that I would have put together. And like that, I'm sure one or two services that even I haven't done. So 1 second now. So what you're going to do is you're obviously going to just go into your normal Google. You're going to go into www.havenhub.ie. Yeah. And what you're going to do now is if you're going up here, as you can see, local supports. So that's where I've categorized them. So when I say categories, obviously these are the different categories that you might find. Now, some people, and for a lot of the time, especially people in crisis, they come into a number of different categories, and that's what can be confusing. And you're going to try and help them come up with their plan to put enough supports together to be able to get to a better place. The different categories that I have here would be obviously distress supports, addiction supports, there's youth supports, support groups, there's financial and homeless supports, there's social supports for loneliness, there's trauma and abuse supports, there's well-being courses, there's low-cost counselling services, there's parent and child supports, bereavement supports, LGBTQ supports, and other supports. Now, guys, what you're really trying to do here is show that there is so many more options out there besides suicide. There's so much help that they haven't connected with yet. I've obviously been in my own recovery for a while, and even I have not tried a lot of supports that's out there yet. Like, for example, exercise, because I'm really lazy. I haven't tried exercise as a wellness tool yet. But you're not going to know what will suit them, so you're not there to tell them what they need to do. You're just there to kind of guide them and see, depending on their story, depending on their issues, what supports can you agree would be the right ones to kind of link in with, and then you're going to stay linked with them, and try and help them to link with that support. So, for example, let's say that one of the people that you're supporting that is feeling suicidal, one of their main difficulties might be, let's just say, loneliness. So you talk to them and they've disconnected from their friends, or maybe they've come over from a different country and they just have no support. So obviously it could be any of these, but I'm just giving an example. Okay, I'd like you to go through every one of these and try and get to know them, obviously, over time yourselves. But say, worst case scenario, just take out the laptop and say, let's have a look together at some of the supports that might be able to help you. So if you were dealing with somebody where loneliness was the main issue, then you'd go in there to supports for loneliness. And if you scroll down, there's usually always a page 2, by the way. So even like that now, this is probably the only one that there isn't a page 2, but if you hover over it, you'll see a page 2 normally there. So then you're going to go through each one and talk to them. So if loneliness is their main issue, one of the ones that I would always recommend for loneliness would be Limerick Mental Health Association. They run classes, and it's not all recovery based. Some of them it's music classes, creative writing, meditation. There's men's shed, there's coffee mornings, there's Sunday social. Some of them, depending on restrictions, might be face to face. Some of them are through Zoom. Their website is there. You can go in and you can see what classes is on every day, and there's different classes on. It's only €2. So if somebody is struggling and they're also looking to just get out there and meet other people and be around other people, Limerick Mental Health is one of the ones that I'd always recommend. If they're a man, obviously men kind of at times, I don't mean to generalize, but at times men can find it harder to just sit down. Women are great to kind of, we'll meet for coffee and various different things. Men find it a lot harder. So there's the men's sheds, where what research has shown is that if men are doing an activity, they'll chat away about what's going on in their lives for them, and that kind of support will help them. So a lot of the times I'll recommend the men's shed. And again, depending on if you click on that link there, you'll see all the men's sheds that's available in Limerick. If they've tried that, there's so many of them around. Maybe they didn't like the one they went to, they might like someone in it. Try another one, Then you have things like the next one there is Limerick Sports and Social Club, and they meet up and they go to things like bowling, they go to comedy nights, they go to the cinema, and the phone number is there. If the person has been into sport, and just mentioned in their story that they used to love playing badminton or something like that, or whatever, there's Limerick Sports Partnership. That's their website there, and you could look into that. They also do a lot of wellness courses. And if they're well enough, and if you feel okay, well, volunteering might be a way to go. So you can obviously meet new people and socialize with volunteering. And there's a website there, volunteer.ie. It might be just working in a local charity shop or something like that. Get them a bit of structure, give them something to do in their day. If they've lost their job, maybe giving back might give them that sense of being needed again, So depending on their story, depending on how they are, there's some ideas. They might want to do a course, fetch.ie is a very good website for any local courses that's on. That will be another thing that you could discuss with them. And if you go into that website, you'll see loads of different courses, not necessarily academic courses. It could be a course on on furniture restoration or something like that. It could be a course on music therapy or something that they want to do. So there's so much on that in the line of courses. It'll get them out. It'll make Mondays different to Wednesdays. That's the kind of thing that'll be good for them. Obviously there's support groups, which is a different section altogether, and support groups can be great, just to sit in a room with other people in a safe environment, to know that you're not the only one that's struggling, can be very, very helpful. At the moment, obviously with the pandemic, it's very difficult to do that because a lot of it is through Zoom, but even through Zoom it can be very helpful just to see the amount, and depending on their issues, like there's AA if they're struggling with addiction, there's Grow, there's Aware, there's Recovery. If you go into the support group section there, you'll see all of them. Similarly, like local health and community centres is there. So you can go into to this list here, and it'll give you some of the local community centres that can really, they have a lot of classes. It could be in dance, it could be in loads of different things, local bingo, that kind of thing. So guys, that's just an example of one category, so and that's just if it's loneliness. Now what if it's not loneliness? If it's nothing to do with loneliness, what if it's that they can't meet their mortgage and they're just so stressed about that? Well, obviously you're going to go into financial supports there. Well-being courses can nearly be run into everything. I did a wellness course, a RAP program, and while it in itself isn't the only thing that helps me to stay well, it's a huge part of it. And now, like, I don't know where I'd be without having had my RAP program in place at times, especially during crisis. So go into wellbeing courses, go into support groups, low cost counselling services. They're the general ones, and then depending on the issue, you have some more specific ones there. But the more that's available, the better you can actually help them. So that's how you refer somebody. And like I say, referring them, the best thing you can do is obviously go with them, but you're not going to be doing that if it's you're in there as a volunteer. But the next best to that is kind of giving them the information, and checking in with them maybe after they're meant to. So if they're meant to give if they're in with you the weekend, and if they're meant to give one of the services a ring on the Monday and try and check in with them, it could be Pieta House or something like that, or maybe you might arrange for a follow-up for a Wednesday to see, okay, well, did they have the energy to link in with that service? They might need to come in and talk to the Haven Hub again before they'll be able to link in with them. Don't just do a kind of tag you're it. Let them know that you're thinking about them and things like that. And even if it's not you to do the follow-up, if it's another volunteer or somebody else to it's a good feeling to say, look, you were in with Samantha there last weekend, and Samantha asked me to give you a ring because she was wondering how you're doing, and I'm just wondering how you're feeling today. Guys, just in summary again, what you're looking for here is first of all, you're looking to notice an invitation. What is it that somebody says or does or behaves in a way that makes you think, I wonder if there's suicidal? Minute you see that, or the minute you kind of wonder if the person is suicidal, you're going to ask the question. You're going to do it directly. And we discussed the ways in which you can do that. I hear you say there that you just don't want to wake up. Can I check? Are you feeling suicidal? Would be an example. You're going to reassure them that they did the right thing in telling you, and that you're glad that And then the very next thing, now that you're asking the question and they're in that open space, is you're going to ask them, have they thought about how? Have they a plan? And then after that, you're going to try and persuade them to get help and refer them to other services that is going to actually take them out of their pain. And that takes time, and it's dependent on what kind of, I suppose, issues it has come up and what their story has been to say what services will be appropriate. So guys, now that we've done that, on QPR2, you're going to end up doing some role play situations. Don't be scared about that. That's just literally us running through it and just having a go, getting those words out of your lips to ask that question and things like that. So that'll be a live session with a trained facilitator. So other than that, I need you to log on and just answer some questions now that you've done QPR1. And if you log into the link there for the training directions, you'll see just the questionnaire, just to make sure that you've gotten the basics of QPR1. If you do get the wrong answers, it should tell you, so you can go in and change your answer. So don't stress too much about it. But once you've that done, and once you feel, yeah, I've gotten this, then just make your appointment through the link for QPR2. Thanks, everyone.